So really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So I work directly for Mr. Mark Whitney. Mark is not only our acting assistant secretary at the moment, but his other full-time job is a little bit longer. It's the principal deputy assistant secretary for environmental management, the EM2, as we call it. So I work straight for him right in Washington. And like my title says, I take care of the acquisition and project management business. So as we go through this, sir, do you want to allow a couple of questions? Is it okay to allow questions as I go through this? I want to kind of make this interactive and make sure that I'm answering the mail on this. So
certainly agreeable with me. I think we like it that way.
Okay,
so
that'd be fine with me. So
questions asked if you're willing to take them.
I mean, we can wait till the end, but if you got something burning that you really want to get to, we can cover it right then and there.
Thank you, Jack.
Okay, so the purpose of this slide is, and I'm not going to walk you through everything here, but we're on a journey here on improving the delivery of our work. You know, get our work done on cost, on schedule. There's some great examples of great positive examples across the Office of Environmental Management. And unfortunately, there are some examples that go the other way also. So definitely there's work to be done here. So just pointing out a couple things. And so this chart shows a range of activities. Some of them involved the National Academy of Public Administration. Some involved getting assistance from the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And the top symbol there are kind of Department of Energy kinds of things. So, and I promise I will not go over all of these. But if you went back a number of years, actually to the spring of 2006, it's actually right after I joined Office of Environmental Management, the National Academy of Public Administration began an assessment of our management practices. That is a public document, so if you wanted to Google NAPA, National Academy of Public Administration, and look for their report, they looked at 4 different things. They looked at acquisition, and that was a heavy look. They looked a little bit at project management, a little bit how we were organized, and a little bit of human capital stuff. So that, if you all have not seen that before, that may be of interest. In 2007, we put in place what we call a cost estimating center of excellence. That's actually located at our Consolidated Business Center. The Consolidated Business Center is in Cincinnati. Director is Mr. Jack Craig, who's joining us today. And what that office is doing there is as you're going to see in the type of procurements that we're doing, there's a big need to do government cost estimates, and so they are providing this support across the complex, wherever it's needed. We then had the Army Corps of Engineers come in and help us with what we labeled a best-in-class project and contract management assessment kind of a program. The Department of Energy then in 2008 started along a root cause analysis. What are the sorts of things that we need to do better on to deliver our work on cost and on schedule. Let's see, I'll bring you up to 2010. We really did a lot of training on project management, contract management, financial management, things like that, across the board in the Office of Environmental Management. Mainly on the federal side, with our federal employees. The Secretary of Energy had a contract and project management summit right at the end of 2010. And so he was looking at things, again, the focus is getting the work done on cost, on schedule. And then I'm going to point out, I'm going to come back to this, the next big thing the deputy did is issued a policy guidance at the end of 2012. This was Deputy Secretary Poneman, labeled aligning contract incentives, so I'll be talking about that a little bit more. And then the American Recovery Act, $5.9 billion of work. Now this is one where I think environmental management gets an A+ on. That entire range of work was completed on cost in 92% of cases. And I'm talking capital projects, non-capital projects, all sorts of stuff at all of our sites, to include Los Alamos. I think we led the way at the Department of Energy, quite frankly, on the, on getting the Recovery Act done, getting the money, out the door, obligated, definitely the shovel-ready, sorts of stuff. So lots of good stuff there. So I'll stop there. So I just kind of wanted to give you a gist of the sorts of stuff that is going on. So a little bit on contracting now. And again, if I speak in tongues, please stop me. We tend to use abbreviations and things like that a lot, so if I say something that doesn't make sense, please stop me. So I would suggest that the Office of Environmental Management is in a very different place than most of the Department of Energy when it comes to type of contract used. The type of contract used by most of the department is a very specialized form of contract called a M&O, or Management and Operating Form of Contract, that you really don't find very much outside the Department of Energy. So if you were to look at the EM portfolio, we went back to the late 1990s, we essentially had one M&O contract per site that EM work was at, realizing that EM was only stood up in 1989. So we had 12 M&O contracts, management and operating. Today, we have 2. And in place of those 12, we have over 35, what I would term major, not M&O contracts. These are Federal Acquisition Regulation, Part 15, cost-based contracts. They're more traditional type of contracts if you're talking to somebody from another federal agency. That's the sort of contracts that other federal agencies use, with the exception, most of ours are still cost reimbursable. Lots of other federal agencies actually use lots of fixed price approaches, not cost reimbursable. So that's one thing I wanted to bring to your attention. And those types of contracts, I believe we've had great success on, because they at the end of the day, we're really allocating more risk to the contractors if they do, if they meet the contract requirements, can actually earn more fee. So we are actually across the board seeing greater performance of work by contractors under these sorts of contracts, vice the M&O sort of a contract. Okay? A little bit about small business, and I'll talk about this later. We have a continued focus on small businesses with respect to our portfolio.
Jack?
Yes, sir.
You have the third item there, using partnering. Could you explain that to us?
Oh, sure, partnering.
I didn't quite
I'm sorry, yeah,
catch what you meant by that.
Okay, so we're starting in 2010. We have a voluntary partnering approach in place across the complex. And the way we got into this is actually we had a kind of a summit. Day one, we had contractor reps both from sites and corporations in town. Day two, we had headquarters and site federal employees, and they kind of ranked issues as they saw them. And as it turns out, the number one thing from both lists was we need to do a better job of working together. So that's where partnering came from. So what our partnering policy is it's kind of the partnering policy that other federal agencies have been using for 30 years. So we're focused at the site level, and we're focused between the site manager and his or her team and the particular prime contractor and his or her team. Okay, so this is not headquarters and the corporations, this is at the site level. So here at Los Alamos, this would be, we're talking about Pete and his team and the contractor and his team. Or in the future, it could be her team. We'll see where we're at. And here's what we're after with partnering, because you bring up a great question. Partnering can mean lots of things. We're kind of at I think, a fairly basic but very powerful level. We're after ensuring that the site manager and the prime contractor teams are aligned on what it is we're trying to do. And that sounds very simplistic, but we have found sometimes there are issues there, that those two teams are not aligned on what we're trying to do with that particular contract. So that's one thing. The second thing we're trying to do is do an even better job of ensuring that problems and issues are identified as early as possible. You know, this has always been a push, but we just want to up that a little bit more. And the third thing is we want to have violent agreement that things are solved at the lowest accountable level. And so there's actually for the sites and the contractors that have gone through this, there's actually a 2-day partnering session that we go through. And at the end of that, there's a document that captures some of the thoughts, but there's a zipper chart actually that shows who the counterparts are. So who are the public affairs counterparts, who's the contract management counterparts, the CFO counterparts, the nuclear safety, and on and on. There could be 15 or 20 of these. And those folks are supposed to solve issues, and if they can't, it goes up to the site manager and the project manager or president for that company. So those are the three things that we're after on partnering. It's site-based, it's voluntary, and this does not replace the contract. So I would say that this is kind of a communication framework. It's a framework on how to work together to get the job done. Okay? All right, so I'll come back. I'll talk a little bit more about small business in a bit. And so now I'm going to move on to the EM procurement policy. So these are kind of the big, when I boil down what we're trying to do with procurements, this is how I would kind of boil things down to. So what are we after? We want to make sure that the taxpayer and the contractor's interests are taken into account. So, the first bullet is if a contractor does a great job, we want the contractor to earn maximum fee. To the extent they don't, unfortunately, we would be in a situation then where we wouldn't want them to earn a lot of fee. So that's what we're trying to do there. The second thing is there's examples across the complex where we have not done sufficient, what I'll call upfront planning. We have not had the technologies figured out. We haven't had the technologies matured. We have not had a mature design. If we're characterizing environmental remediation, maybe we should have done more characterization. But yet we started to do the work. And many times we've gotten into lots of trouble there. It's cost a lot more and caused lots of issues. So we want to try to do a better job there. Third bullet, this is a huge change. When I joined the Office of Environmental Management 8 or 9 years ago, basically everything was going to be cost reimbursable, and you had to prove that you were going to do something fixed priced, and which is like that's 180 degrees out from how most other agencies operate. So now the way we're working is we're going to do it fixed priced or fixed rate or fixed something, and only if we cannot do it would we consider a cost reimbursable approach. So that's a 180 out. And I'm going to give you some examples in a little bit of what we've done fixed priced, and when I walk you through our ongoing procurements right now, you'll kind of see what we're doing there. Where we cannot firm fixed price something, we want to look at cost caps or ceilings or something like that. Again, we're trying to overcome some of the really problematic issues we've had with certain work where costs have gone way through the roof, and we're trying to prevent that. So again, on incentives, I mean, again, if we're not going to use a fixed price kind of approach, then we want our incentives to be objective, vice qualitative. And I think, frankly, in environmental management, we're doing a pretty good job of that already. We typically have pretty black and white quantitative approaches on fee, vice qualitative. Sure, yes, ma'am, question.
As you move through this, sorry. As you move through this detailed information, where you differ a little from NNSA, that would be helpful for us to understand where
Okay.
those opportunities are.
Okay, I'll answer that right at the end of this page. So, so I mentioned incentives. Again, we want to ensure that parties bear responsibility for their actions. So, again, we're not looking to. We want to be careful and not be paying final fee to a contractor in years 1, 2, 3, and 4, and in year 5, when we're supposed to get across the finish line, we don't get there. If that happens, then we would not want to have that fee be held by that contractor. So that's the sorts of things that are going to be, that may very well be in our, that are in some of our instruments right now and will be in some of them going forward. And then we want to make sure contractors are held accountable. So I don't want to focus on the negative. Where a contractor does great work, I'm happy whenever I see that, frankly, because I want to be successful. The Department of Energy wants to be successful. What's the best way for us to be successful? If our contractors are successful. I mean, if you think about it, there's a couple cases where we can be viewed as successful if our contractor isn't, but typically not. It's typically together. And in some cases, the contractor can be successful and we're not. So we want to. So there's a source selection sensitive. So that means it's not open to the public annual rating that all contractors get. If the contractor's done great and somebody goes in there, that's what we want to. That's what should be documented in there. If the contractor did not do a good job, then unfortunately that's what needs to be documented in there. So Allison, to come back to you, if Bob Raines, my counterpart in NNSA at headquarters, came here, he'd be talking about the same sort of stuff. Now, I think we're in a little bit of a different place because NNSA has a relatively small number of very large management and operations contracts, and you heard what we have. For their capital work, they are certainly trying to establish fixed price sorts of arrangements. They've done this, I know they've done this here at Los Alamos on their contract for some of their work. So maybe at a future session, you might want to have somebody from the NNSA side come here and give you some examples on that. But I know they have, and I know they're doing that at other sites. So they're following the same sort of overall guidance with respect to trying to allocate risk to the contractor, et cetera, et cetera. Okay?
Do I understand NNSA spends more money on M&O contracts, a few large ones, and EM spends more money on the cost-based or the FFP?
Correct. We have, our portfolio has about 35 major contracts, of which nominally 33 are what I will call traditional contracts. 2 are M&O. NNSA has, I believe, maybe about 10 or so large contracts, and yet they're much larger than us, and almost all of those are M&O.
Okay, and just one last comment. Probably a fallacy, but when I hear these terms and think about them at a very ignorant citizen level that I'm coming from, I think of M&O contracts as having more room for scope creep. Is that true? Can you address that point?
I've turned to the next page.
Ken,
and
another question. Could you go back to that holding contractors accountable?
Yes, sure.
Within that item, let's say a contractor, you find him at fault.
Yeah.
On some project. And because of that fault, there are fines levied by either the local, environmental group or
the regulator,
mine safety or somebody like that.
Right.
Does the contract indicate that he would be liable for some of that fine? Or how do you address that kind of thing?
I don't know if I can give you the complete answer, and Jack, I'll ask the other Jack to help me if he can. I think there are some times in our contracts when the contractor would be liable for certain fines, and in other cases that the Department of Energy would end up either paying or reimbursing the contractor. But so it depends on what the exact situation is, and it unfortunately gets a little bit complicated in our business, but
Well, that's why I guess I was asking about if you consider he was liable or, you know, responsible for the problem, and you were
Well,
fine, would you assess some of that fine to
well,
the contractor?
let me give you so let's not talk about a fine, but let's talk about the difference between a fixed price and a cost reimbursable instrument. I'm going to bring up a general case, but I'll try to get to your point. So if a certain scope of work is supposed to be done, and in the case when you have a fixed price contract, the contractor makes a mistake. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. The contractor makes a mistake. It's the contractor's issue. They're going to have to remedy it, tear something out, redo it, et cetera. As long as nothing in the contract changed. It was their mistake, they're liable. Okay. In a cost reimbursable contract, typically we would end up paying for the redo of the work. And that's why, I mean, a cost reimbursable is a very high-risk form of contracting. You really should not, you should only be doing it where you really have to, vice a blanket approach to doing cost reimbursable work. So that's, I mean, so I'm giving you kind of an extreme situation, but that's what we kind of get into. So now you're in a cost reimbursable contract, and now you're asking a very specific situation about a regulatory fine. So that's where now I have to say it kind of depends on exactly what the issue was. But if the contractor was totally liable for it, I think there are instances where the payment of that fine came out of the contractor's pocket with no reimbursement from the Department of Energy. So, Jack, is there anything you can add?
Well, I would agree. I think it just depends on what the contract says. I'm familiar with a contract that had a ceiling, such as the contractor was liable for up to $200,000 of fines and penalties. I've been involved in contracts where they're liable for all fines and penalties, and some they're not liable for any. So I think you just need to read the specific contract.
Okay. All right, and Allison, at the end of this next page, I'm going to get back to your question. So what I'm going to try to do here, I'm laying out the difference between the management and operating, you know, you'll hear me say M&O, and the traditional. So the traditional is the form of contracting that we have moved to or are moving to, okay? So, first of all, with respect to the first line, which you don't know what I'm talking about because I abbreviate it by far, is the Federal Acquisition Regulation, sorry. So these are both okay contracts for the feds to use. They're different parts of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, okay? But the approach, let's talk about the approach now. So, and I'll always talk about what the M&O is, and then I'll say what the traditional is. So they're very, very different. The M&O is a kind of a mission, so very broad, and it's a budget-based approach. You're going to get $200 million next year. What can you do in that year? The traditional are scope-based and they're cost-based. So they're not budget-based, they're cost-based, and those are two different things. So M&O, $200 million, what can you do? Versus if we have a competitive contract, we're going to bound it with the scope, and we're going to try to identify a target cost. So if the target cost is $185 million, then that's what we're going to give the contractor in that year, not $200 million. We're going to give them $185 because that's what the contract says. With respect to execution, the M&O is kind of an annual work plan kind of a sort of a thing. In a traditional contract, you're looking at the entire contract. So if it's a 3-year contract, all 3 years. If it's a 5-year, all 5 years, all 7 years. So so I'm painting a very stark difference between these two types of contracts, as you're going to see. Term M&Os can go a long time. Our cost type contracts We have some now up to about 10 years, but typically we're going to be abiding by what's called the Service Contract Act, and those are, so we're typically looking at 5-year contracts that we're using now in the Office of Environmental Management. The oversight model, by oversight I'm talking about the DOE feds now. And so I would suggest, and the contractor. So in an M&O, my best description of it is it's integrated. It's an integrated approach.
Jack.
Between the feds and the contractor employees. In a traditional contract, it's arm's length. Now, I'm not trying to say we don't talk or that, you know, but it's just we got to let the contractor do the scope that's in the contract.
Jack, question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Carlos.
I don't see in here past experience as a criteria for selection.
Well, let me address that right now. It has been our policy in the Office of Environmental Management for 3+ years that past performance is the top factor in selection. We typically will have three or four or five factors, and we'll have past performance as number 1, and technical approach normally as number 2, and then a 3 and a 4. So past performance is a big deal to us. So that goes back to where I was saying we want to make sure we put in that system that is not open to the public, you know, make sure we do the proper job of if the contractor hit the ball out of the park, we want the rating to say that, and if they didn't do a good job, the rating's going to say that, because as a part of selecting a new contractor, we're going to go back to that system to see how the contractor did, and use that as a selection in deciding deciding who will be awarded the contract.
So when awarding a contract, is it a rated criteria that people have to score on?
Yeah.
And do you ever run into a situation where work that needs to be done can only be done by one certain contractor and you don't have to bid it out?
Okay, so no, I can't remember really. We end up having really good competition across the Office of Environmental Management on our competitive proposals. We're typically getting multiple teams coming in trying to get the work at the prime level, absolutely across the board. Does that answer what your question was?
Well, I guess I'm still wondering, is the criteria weighted when selecting? In other words, you have a score that you have to beat?
Oh, no, all right. So the approach we use is we do not use a numbers exact rating. We will use a excellent, very good sort of an approach. So for each of the factors, we will rate a proposer either as excellent or very good or fair in past performance, in technical approach, and whatever the other factors are. So we will rate them and then end up making a selection based on that. Does that answer your question?
Is there a committee that's appointed to do this, or is
Yeah.
it in one office?
No, so essentially here's how it works. I thought that's where you're going. So the way a competitive procurement works across the entire federal government is you will have a source selection official that is the person making the decision. Okay? That source selection official will have what we call a source evaluation board, committee, board, and that will typically be 3 to 5 voting members with probably, depending upon the size of the contract, 10 to 30 folks helping. So at the end of the day, if you let's say you have 4 proposals, the evaluation board will rate each proposal against the RFP in each of the factors. So you'll end up with a matrix. In this case, 4 factors, 4 proposals. Okay? And then and those are just the technical factors. Then they'll do a similar thing on the cost side also. They will evaluate the cost. they're not rating proposer A versus proposer B. What they're doing is they're evaluating proposer A versus the request for proposal, the RFP, proposer B against the RFP, et cetera. So they put that together. It's a more complicated process, but at the end of the day, the source selection official gets a report and has been involved in this the whole way and basically gets to make the decision. And typically these days, we're using what we call a best value decision. So it's not necessarily low cost. We are looking for what's the best value to, for the taxpayers, for what we're trying to buy.
Best bang for the buck. So like when it comes to Andrews down in waste control, did that go out to bid, or?
I'm sorry, when it comes to what?
Waste control specialist, when that contract was awarded, was there other bidders on that?
We currently have a single, well, which are you talking about?
He's referring to the True Waste Storage, the Los Alamos
Okay.
waste stored there.
All right. The way we got to them is we currently have a nationwide independent delivery, independent quantity contract for treatment and disposal of waste that can be, and that was competitively put in place about 5 years ago, and we had a whole long list of types of waste, and we ended up having 2 awards, Energy Solutions and WCS. So that's a standing contract that any federal entity or any prime contractor can order off of. So I believe in the case of Los Alamos, that's how they got to WCS contractually to do the work you're describing. Okay? All righty. Is that, so I was on oversight and scope. Oh, and so source selection, I think, well, so the one thing I would add to that the great questions you asked is typically on an M&O, there is no cost proposal. None. On a traditional contract, there's a cost proposal. And if it's for 5 years of work, it's the cost proposal for the 5 years worth of work. So that's a huge difference, a huge, huge difference. With respect to pricing, there is, on an M&O contract, you typically don't have pricing information when you're doing changes. With the traditional, the contractor has to certify their cost and pricing. Fee on an M&O is typically going to be lower, relatively lower. I say 3 to 8. In traditional, it can be as high as 15%. Okay. And the reason for that is we believe the contractor is bearing more risk, so therefore, if they hit the ball out of the park, they can earn more fee. Okay, contract modifications, there are very few with an M&O. There are lots on a cost-type contract. That's a real big deal. Accounting. The accounting system is integrated with Department of Energy at all M&O places that have M&O contracts. We are typically using the normal approach, which is the contractor would have their own system. That's where we're going on the traditional. So, with respect to the contracting officer, the federal contracting officer, suffice it to say, they've got lots. There's a lot more work and tasks for them to do in a traditional than an M&O. A lot of times on an M&O contract, when you recompete it, one of the provisions is whatever contract employees are there for contractor A, contractor B just gets all of them. Typically, we don't do that typically. Whoever the winning proposal is, they don't have to take the whole workforce if they don't think they need it. So that's another kind of a difference. So, Allison, did I, through all that, answer the question that you asked? Okay, all right. Okay, so after we award a contract, there's lots of work to do. If it's an award fee type of contract, there'll be a performance evaluation and measurement plan, or PEMP, P-E-M-P. That's done on an annual basis, and that's how you determine how much fee a contractor receives that year. If it's a cost reimbursable award fee type of contract, somebody has to be a fee determining official to make that decision. So this is the Contractor Performance Assessment Reporting System. I mentioned that before. There's work having to do with workforce restructuring plans. Since we have an incumbent workforce, contractor workforce in place at the Department of Energy, and there's contract management plans. So there's lots of work to be done managing a contract. So a little bit about the overall EM program, and then I'm going to get back into some procurement stuff. So in FY15, we have a total of about $6.3 billion. That includes newly appropriated funds as well as what I'll call carryover funds. So these were funds that were not obligated as of or expended as of the end of FY14. And broadly, one way to cut our work is capital projects and operations. So capital projects, about $1.1 billion goes to capital projects. By far the largest is WTP. I'm sorry about the abbreviation, Waste Treatment Plant. It's out in Hanford. And then SWPF is Salt Waste Processing Facility that's down in Savannah River. So that's just the amount that they will get funded this fiscal year. So I've shown a little bit of information on our line item projects and a little bit of information on the rest of our capital program and our operations activity. So I just wanted to give you just a high-level look at our office and on one way to cut across the work. So now a little bit, I promised or I mentioned that the Deputy Secretary really is the one that pushed us a couple years ago to really do a better job with upfront planning and really take a hard look at fixed pricing work. So that, and really make that the default position. So quickly, I'm going to go through now and show you what we've done fixed price-wise. And I'm going to get through the rest of these slides relatively quickly. I know there's a lot of slides, but I'm just going to spend just seconds on each of them. So I've got 5 or 6 examples of fixed price work. And I'm describing you the scope, showing you a picture, telling you the cost, and giving you some basic chronology information at the bottom. So down at Savannah River, they had a rickety old coal-fired plant producing electricity and steam that they could hardly afford to keep running, and they certainly could not afford to buy a new one. So we ended up using an energy savings performance contract and brought a contractor in. They built a new plant, and of course it's not coal-fired, it's biomass-fired. It's brand spanking new. It cost about $200 million. Instead of paying outright $200 million, the company essentially took out a mortgage, and we rolled in the operating costs, and over an 18 period, it will take 18 years for us to pay this off. During that time, the contractor owns the plant, maintain it, and operate it at no additional cost to the Department of Energy. So $795 million fixed price deal with Amoresco, and things are going great. The other issue they had down there, they were nearing that area had a non-attainment kind of a deal going on. So this is a much cleaner burning plant, so that was another thing that we were able to do there. Okay, at Oak Ridge, during the Recovery Act, the K33, this is one of the smaller, relatively smaller gaseous diffusion plants. It had been well characterized. The typical, the EM probably 10 years ago would have done this on a cost reimbursable basis. We did not. It was done fixed priced. I believe there were folks from LATA here. LATA was the prime contractor, I think, and did a bang-up job. This was a radioactive contaminated facility, but again, it had been well characterized, so it was fixed priced, and oh, by the way, this was a small business set aside, so it was a small business that did it. Okay, out at Moab, the second contractor the current contractor we have out there now, which is the second. The first contractor was a large business. It happened to be Energy Solutions. They did a real fine job of getting things going, but when we came to re-procure it, it appeared that we had 2 or more interested and qualified small businesses out there, so that's what we did. We ended up having really good competition here, and I think Portage is the contractor in place today. It's about $125 million. It's a hybrid. It's a combination of fixed price and cost reimbursable. Things are going well there. Small business set aside. WIP, we have a couple of transportation contracts in place. They're fixed rate in support of that transportation mission. Out at Hanford, this is about almost $100 million. This is the occupational medical work, so it's the doctors and nurses. Again, this was one that had historically been done by a large business on a cost reimbursable basis. We converted it to fixed price, and it's working just fine, and it was a small business set-aside also. And out at E-Tech, our latest, out in California, this work had been done actually by Boeing, as it was an M&O type of contract. So again, when we looked at the work to be done, we found that, number one, we could in fact fix price this, and this also ended up being a small business set-aside. Okay, so a little bit more about small business. This is something we keep in mind all the time, actually, in the federal government. We are required to set aside for small business any work that small business can do. The rule is you have to have 2 qualified and 2 interested parties, a minimum of 2. If you do, you're supposed to set it aside for small business. So this is our kind of our policy statement. We are after sustainable small business, so I'm not looking to do a maneuver that generates 5 or 10 million as a one-time thing. We're really after setting aside work that can be done on a long-term basis by small business. And here's a graph that shows how we're doing. The spike in 2010 was the Recovery Act. Actually, the federal government's supposed to do 23% of its overall contracting work via small business. I don't think we're not going to get there any day soon. So we've had a kind of a nice uptrend here so in 2014, it's a little complicated. We actually did $421 million of small business at the prime contract level. You may be familiar that in fiscal year 14, the law changed, and for M&O contracts, you can count a subcontract for an M&O contractor counts as if it's a prime small business contractor only in the Department of Energy. So instead of $421 million, we did $560 million. So if you count things according to that way, our numbers add up to 10.6%. So we're going to be kind of in that range going forward, I think. And we have contractors that are doing very complicated, difficult work. We have a small business contractor in Oak Ridge operating a transuranic waste processing facility, for instance. We have small business contractors doing infrastructure at Portsmouth and Paducah, et cetera. So we make sure that work that we set aside for small businesses is work that they can actually do and be successful. Okay, yes, Allison.
Who in the federal government hits the 23%?
Most other agents, so the question was who in the federal government hits the 23%. Frankly, most other agencies the Department of Energy's business model is different with the combination of M&O contracts and incumbent workers. Obviously, since they're large contracts, those contracts aren't small businesses, so none of that counts. So, but Department of Defense, for instance, I know exceeds the 23%. They may do some agencies will do very high amount of work with small businesses. Historically, we just have not been able to. It's the business model, and the complexity of the work, frankly, with especially some of the EM work and especially a lot of the NNSA work, I would suggest. All right, quickly now, these are current procurements. This is our current ongoing procurement. So we have a architect-engineer contract out at Oak Ridge that will be awarding any day now. At Hanford, 222S, this is a lab services contract. So on all of these, I'm giving you some scope, some estimated values, and I'm showing you when we put out the request for proposal, when proposals came in, and when we're going to award. So we're in source selection right now. Project to award in March, April, May of 15. This is a small business set aside. Transuranic waste processing, this is the one I was just sort of talking about. This is relatively big. Over a 5-year period, this is $150 to $200 million. So it's huge. $150 to $200 million is a lot of money. And proposals were received right before Christmas. We should have an award not later than May to July of 15, so this summer. Small business set aside. Let's see, this is I was talking about the vehicle that Energy Solutions and WCS has, so we are re-procuring that right now. So RFP will be going out this spring and should be making an award by the summer. So this is treatment and disposal. At Paducah, we have this is a firm fixed price up to a 5-year deal, 45 to 60 million. We're in source selection right now. Small business set aside. It previously was a small business, but it was cost reimbursable. So this is, just like Oak Ridge, this is a firm fixed price sort of a deal. Portsmouth, very similar except much larger, 130 to 150 million. Proposals at the moment are due next week. Award in the summer. Okay, out of Idaho, we have 3 procurements. We have a small fixed price, small business set aside. We are a little bit behind, as you'll see on the dates there. Our draft request for proposal went out, so hopefully we'll have a final request for proposal out in February or so. At Portsmouth, depleted uranium hexafluoride, we've declared that we're going to be re-procuring. It's going to be a full and open competition. It'll be a cost type of contract, probably cost plus incentive fee. And there's the dates. Idaho is a really big one. It's in the billions. Again, our schedule was to have had the RFP out by December. We've missed that. We would hope to do that in a matter of weeks, in February or early March at the latest. So that's in excess of $1 billion. It'll be over a 5-year period. Award that towards the end of this calendar year, maybe a little bit later, depending upon when we get the RFP out. We're going to be looking for an architect engineer at some point to help us with the calcine mission up at Idaho. It's all at the moment. We've got some programmatic issues to work out, and so it's TBD. So the last page here, there's a bunch of information that we keep updated on our public website. So we show information on fees that our major contractors earned, a list of the major contractors. If you wanted to track see what major procurements we have, I mean that's shown up there. So lots of information. Actually, if you have not looked at the environmental management homepage, there's lots of really fantastic info on there, and there's in fact one block that shows the history of this sort of work at the at Department of Energy, and the predecessor agency. So it's really really neat. So with that, any follow-on questions, sir?
We have talked last time, and I think we're going to hear more now, about a new contract with EM to do the work at the Los Alamos lab. Is that going to be an M&O contract or a traditional contract? Or
I'll answer that, Jack. All right. So where we're at, and I did not list the current ongoing action because in this briefing. So where we're at is, as you saw, we stated our intent to sole source with lands for a period of time. And the federal acquisition regulation required us to do the following. We had to tell the public that was our intention and the reasons behind it, to allow any firms anybody out there that did not agree with that to come forward. So that we did not We're past that point now, so we are now actively working with lands to come to a mutual agreement. It will take lands and the Department of Energy to agree on the contractual instrument going forward. It is not going to be an M&O. Our work, it's going to be a separate contract between Department of Energy and lands, and it will not be an M&O. The M&O that lands has with NNSA stays in place. This will be a separate sole-sourced instrument for a period of time. We're calling it a bridge contract because it will only remain in place until we get to the final solution on the contract or contracts that we're going to bring forward to do the work. And we, quite frankly, have not decided on that yet. And Jack's going to get more into that. I'll stay here in case he needs any help. But we're obviously going to be looking and welcome any input from folks such as you as we go through this process. Let me personally guarantee and state that